Winston S. Churchill, The World Crisis, Volume 5, Chapter 20, The Fall of Warsaw. We have now to chronicle the flood of disasters that the victory of Gorlice Tarnow opened upon the Russians. During the whole of the summer and autumn of 1915, they had to face the almost ceaseless attack of nearly 40 German divisions and of nearly the whole of the Austrian armies. Already weakened in quality and structure by the injuries they had received and in the worst phase of their munition supply, the armies of the Tsar presented an 800-mile front to the successive German thrusts, which now here, now there, broke the line or forced deep and rapid retirements. The consequences of such defeats wherever they had occurred endangered the life of Russian armies far beyond the reverberations of the cannonade. We have the spectacle of the German warrior setting himself with prodigious energy to beat the life out of the Russian giant. The summer campaign of 1915 was the only time when very large German forces maintained a continuous, unrelenting offensive against the Russian front. Dragging along the Austrian armies, with which they were often interspersed, the Germans marched forward into Russia, upon the kind of plans which had long been Conrad's dream, but which the armies of the dual monarchy could never have executed. The tale is one of hideous tragedy and measureless and largely unrecorded suffering. Considering the state of their armies and organization, the Russian resistance and constancy are worthy of the highest respect. The strategy and conduct of the Grand Duke, bearing up amid ceaseless misfortune, with crumbling fronts, with congested and threatened communications, with other anxieties still further in rear, which most military commanders are spared, fills a chapter in military history from which a future generation of Russians will not withhold their gratitude. He yielded provinces, he yielded cities, one after another, he yielded river lines. He was driven from Galicia, he was driven from Poland. In the north he was driven far back upon Russian soil. He gave up his conquests, he gave up Warsaw, he gave up all his fortresses. The whole defended front broke under the hammer. All its railways passed to the service of the invader. The entire population fled in terror and agony before the advancing storm. When at last the autumn rains choked the roads with mud and winter raised its shield before a tortured nation, the Russian armies, extricated from their perils, stood along a still continuous line from Riga on the Baltic to the Romanian frontier, with a future before them from which the hopes of general victory were not banished. The easterly advance of the German 11th Army from the scene of its victory carried it by the end of May to Przemysl. The Grand Duke determined not to surrender troops in the defense of the fortress. When the German and Austrian columns lapped it on both sides, the two army corps which it would have required to stand a siege withdrew towards Lemberg and other battlefields with which we are familiar. An attempt by the Austro-German Südarmee under Linsingen to envelop the extreme Russian left came to naught. Indeed, it was decisively thrown back by a heavy counterstroke. Meanwhile, large Russian reinforcements drawn from their center and north gathered in the path of the conquerors. Progress became slower, and at the beginning of June the assailants paused for rest and reflection. On June 3, High Conference at Pless. OHL, Hindenburg and Ludendorff and AOK. Falkenhayn, Hindenburg, Ludendorff, Hoffmann, Mackensen and Conrad, and over all the Kaiser. The whole situation was reviewed by the 3 or 4 chief captains with their principal officers within call. Italy had entered the war. 600,000 or 700,000 fresh troops already pressed against the Austrians upon the new fronts they had been forced to form along the Isonzo River and in Tyrol. By September, the Italian forces actually in the line would certainly be nearly 1 million strong. Conrad, voicing the sentiment of Vienna, wished above all to strike at the renegade ally. his hated foe who, in his view, after the basest blackmail, had stabbed a struggling neighbor in the back. He wished to withdraw Austrian divisions from Galicia to nourish an offensive against Italy. The Germans demurred. Falkenhayn was still preoccupied about the Dardanelles. The battles on the Gallipoli Peninsula burned fiercely. The Turkish losses were enormous. The assailants, though never strengthened sufficiently to win, were constantly fed with reinforcements. It was rumored that an entire new army was being prepared in England for a further descent. At any moment, moreover, the British fleet, which still lay idle, might resume its attack on Admiral von Usedom's unreplenished batteries. Hostile Serbia, neutral, doubtful Romania still barred the passage of the vital munitions. The Serbs had sunk a ship carrying an ample cargo along the Danube. To crush Serbia, to rally Bulgaria, and open the through route to Constantinople and the Dardanelles filled the mind of the chief of the German General Staff. But beneath all this lay always the supreme anxieties of the Western Front. Already there had been weighty French attacks from Arras and La Bassée. The French armies were regathering their strength after Foch's disastrous, prodigal spring offensive in Artois. Some potent enterprise must be expected from them in the autumn. The British army and artillery grew steadily in strength. The 30 or 40 divisions which had been raised from the eager volunteers of 1914 were now organisms of 9 months' training. The wealth of Britain, with the whole world at her disposal and all the seas and oceans under her control, was surely equipping these new hosts with all they might require. The munition factories in England and America, adapted or expanded at the beginning of the war, would now begin to discharge an ever-broadening stream of rifles, cannons, and shells. Falkenhayn must prepare himself to resist in the autumn efforts hitherto unequalled, and he wanted to withdraw immediately 4 German divisions from the Eastern Front. Lastly, Hindenburg and Ludendorff had their point of view. The twin brethren were still united. Their opinions and methods were unchanged. They had been amazed of the results of Gorlice-Tarnow. These had exceeded their hopes. They saw in what had happened the possibility of a super-Tannenberg, embracing in its sweep the main mass of the whole Russian army. Amid these varying schemes, one plain question stood forth. Should Mackensen, with the spearhead army, go on or stop? Falkenhayn wished to stop. He wished to disengage his divisions. But to stop might not have that result. If the German forces in Galicia were seriously weakened, the Austrians would not be able even to remain stationary. They could not dispense with the full German aid. Until the Russians were beaten much lower, the German divisions must stay. If they stayed, must they not achieve something? Time was fleeting. If they were to advance, they would require further reinforcements. In the end it was decided, so far from weakening Mackensen, to reinforce him with 4.5 divisions drawn from the north and rear of the Eastern Front. A general regrouping of the armies was ordered. The Austrian Third Army was broken up, part being sent to Italy and the rest merged in the other armies. The Second and Fourth Austrian armies on either side of Mackensen were placed under his command. With this great mass he would continue for the present to march east. These changes and the necessary replenishment of the armies were not completed till the middle of June. Mackensen was able to resume his advance on the 19th, and on the 22nd Lemberg passed into German hands. After Lemberg, what to do? Falkenhayn posed the incessant question to OHL. How far do we mean to penetrate Russia? Where are we going to find a decision? At this moment General von Seeckt, Mackensen's chief of staff, officer and professional guide, proposed that the whole of the 11th Army should wheel from the east to the north and should march due north between the Vistula and the Bug in the direction of Südlets and Brest-Litovsk. Falkenhayn approved. The spearhead army turned through a quarter circle and advanced over that same ground towards Lublin and Kolm, across which only a year ago Dankel and Auffenberg had hopefully wended. In short, Conrad's original plan was renewed. But what was to be the cooperation from the north? Where was the other side of the pincer to be applied? In the south all was well. The Russian armies were staggering and mutilated. The upward thrust was to be made by German troops instead of Austrian. What would be sent to meet it from the north and bite off the Polish salient? But here there were differences of view. On June 29, Falkenhayn wrote to Hindenburg that Mackensen had been ordered to advance between the Bug and the Vistula, attacking the enemy wherever he found them. This pressure, he said, would soon help Wojrsz, still forging slowly eastward along his original course. Now was the time for Hindenburg and Ludendorff to move too. Obviously, the 9th German Army west of Warsaw could be depleted and its force used either from the south or the north. If from the north, then surely the southeastward thrust from Orsowets and across the Narew would be the most effective. Thus Falkenhayn revived Conrad's first ideas. But Hindenburg and Ludendorff had more ambitious views. They sought a far wider sweep. They were sure that the Russian masses around Warsaw would escape a mere southeastward scoop across the Narew. The fatal encirclement for the enemy lay in their judgment between Kovno and Grodno, cutting the vital railway through Vilna and Dvinsk to Petrograd. Thereafter the northern German armies should turn southward and march between Brest-Litovsk and the Pripyat swamps, thus entrapping all foes at once. Falkenhayn had no mind for this far-flung operation. He had Serbia and the Western Front to consider. He resisted. Ludendorff proceeded to find all sorts of difficulties in the proposed more modest advance through Orsowets. The swamps on either side of the little fortress would be embarrassing, the condition of the ground at this season of the year prohibitive. The resistance of Orsowets would certainly be obstinate. Hindenburg and Ludendorff could have no hopes of overcoming it. With the deepest regret I felt myself unable to agree to such an offensive even at the suggestion of General Headquarters. In love with their gigantic conception, Hindenburg and Ludendorff riddled with solid technical criticism the more modest alternative. Again high conference, again the Emperor. The same group minus Conrad, this time at Posen. Hindenburg and Ludendorff and OHL, now face to face. Clash of argument, clash of wills, clash of interests. Even for the most noble military figures sometimes fall to the level of ordinary mortals. But the Kaiser ranged himself with Falkenhayn. Brought in as he often was to give a decision, as one might spin a coin, he ordered that the northern attack should be made between and across the Narew and not across the Niemen. Deference, however, was shown by way of compromise to General Ludendorff's objections to the advance by Orsowets. Thus neither Hindenburg and Ludendorff nor OHL had their way. The front of the north attack was shifted further to the south and west. It therefore became less ambitious than even Falkenhayn had desired. But the decision had been taken. The All-Highest had pronounced it, and General von Gallwitz, who had hitherto commanded an army group or detachment, was placed at the head of a newly combined 12th German Army. On July 13 he struck with 12 divisions southeast towards the Narew through a town called Prasnich, which had already witnessed bitter fighting in the spring. In a week Gallwitz, driving in the Russian front, had reached the Narew, and 3 days later his army had crossed it after overcoming the resistance of the minor fortress of Pultusk and Royan. At the same time, the Niemen army made a further advance towards Mitau and Shavli, thus gripping the Russians on its front. Meanwhile, Mackensen, advancing from the south, stood on the line Lublin and Kolm. The fall of Warsaw gleamed upon the German and glared upon the Russian headquarters. Even Falkenhayn scraped 2 more divisions from the Western Front to strengthen General von Gallwitz. At this stage, the requests of Hindenburg and Ludendorff, even though Hindenburg wrote direct to the Kaiser, that these 2 divisions should be sent to the Niemen army and that further troops should be rallied round from Mackensen's army to the same destination, were unceremoniously rejected. The blood of OHL was roused. The hunt was keen. But the Grand Duke was not caught. He retreated in good time. Warsaw was evacuated by the Russians on August 5. The cutting-off movement degenerated into a mere stern chase. The whole line of the Vistula was abandoned by the Russians, but they withdrew their armies in an orderly manner. The only fortress which the Grand Duke allowed himself to defend was Novogeorgievsk. That he should have done so was an error. Why he should have done so is a mystery. Novogeorgievsk was the guardian of Warsaw. If Warsaw was to be abandoned, its significance was destroyed. 5 years before the war, there had been an agitation in Russia to modernize the fortresses of the Vistula and the Narev. The government had recognized the importance of this step. In order to lay down the new forts around Warsaw, they had swept away the old. The war had come before the new had been constructed. Novogeorgievsk at least retained the defenses of 1891. Somewhat improved during the war period. It contained a garrison of over 90,000 men, only militia, but still armed every one of them with a precious rifle. Perhaps to delay the German advance, the Grand Duke left these behind, and the siege of Novogeorgievsk began. For this task, Hindenburg and Ludendorff assembled some 80,000 men of various second-line formations, and they were furnished from Germany with a large part of the siege train, including the Austrian howitzers, which had previously demolished the outlying forts of Antwerp. 6 16-inch and 9 12-inch howitzers forming the very heavy artillery. 44 8-inch howitzers with a few 9-inch and 8-inch guns and 2 companies of 10-inch mortars, together with a respectable concourse of medium pieces, swiftly arrived upon the scene. General von Beseler, the hero of Antwerp, took charge of the siege. The investment was completed on August 10, and the heavy batteries opened a few days later. The task of the attackers was lightened by good luck. The chief engineer of the fortress, driving out to reconnoitre with all its plans in his motor car, had the misfortune to run into the advancing Germans and was duly captured with his documents. The method of attack consisted in the destruction by overwhelming cannon fire of one single sector of the defense, the ruins of which, fort by fort, were then to be stormed. But the militiamen, bearded men going into action, pale with the thoughts of their wives and families, developed a field position in front of the gap, which had first of all to be reduced. Thereafter 6 German battalions stormed Fort 15A and 7 Fort 15B. And although 11 battalions were repulsed with much slaughter from Fort 16A, the assailants were generally established in striking distance of the inner line by August 19. At 4 a.m. on August 20, Novogeorgievsk, after slaughtering its horses and burning its stores, surrendered unconditionally. It had held out for 30 days from the first approach of the besiegers. 90,000 prisoners, including 30 Russian generals, over 700 guns, and many rifles were taken with the place. This may well prove to be the last defense of a first-class ring fortress deprived of the support of a field army. The general retreat of the Russian armies was accompanied by the flight of enormous masses of the inhabitants. Terrified by tales of German cruelty, Millions of people fled from their homes, dragging what belongings they could save along with them in vehicles of every kind. The roads were submerged by these slow-flowing streams of misery. The main current was between Warsaw and Brest-Litovsk. The Russian troops, whether in retreat or advancing to sustain their rearguards, had no choice but to thrust these pitiful crowds from the highways, often in the marshes, which flanked them. Ludendorff says significantly on this subject, "Many scenes in the Russian campaign have been indelibly imprinted on my memory." The veteran General Gurko rejoices that he was not called upon to witness them, as his duty lay in Galicia. But he writes, "Still men who had fought in several wars and many bloody battles told me that no horrors of a field of battle can be compared to the awful spectacle of the ceaseless exodus of a population, knowing neither the object of the movement nor the place where they might find rest, food, and housing. Themselves in an awful condition, they increased the troubles of the troops, especially of the transport, who had to move along roads filled with this disorganized human wave. Many a time our forces had to stop and fight a rearguard action just to allow this crowd to make room for the troops. God only knows what sufferings were endured here, how many tears were shed, and how many human lives were given as victims to the inexorable Moloch of war." The crisis of the campaign was now over. The Russian armies were clear of the Polish salient on which they had counted so dearly, and for which they had sacrificed so much. Their situation was simplified. After August 18, when Kovno fell, the Eastern Front ran almost due north and south through Riga, Kovno, Grodno, and Brest-Litovsk till it trailed along the Galician border to Romania. In the year's campaign, the Germans had killed or wounded nearly 1 million Russians, and had taken 750,000 prisoners. But all chance of a mass encirclement had passed. Hindenburg and Ludendorff's dream of a super Tannenberg were ended. There was still a month's more fighting before the weather broke, and the steady advance of the whole German line pushed the Russian front and the fugitive population another 100 to 150 miles to the eastward. The final line at the end of September lay through Dvinsk along the Dwina, due south to the Pripyat marshes, and thence through the southern corner of Galicia to the Romanian frontier. It was at this moment that the Tsar indulged the wish he had so long cherished. Against the warning and appeals of his ministers, but with the ardent support of his wife, he assumed personal command of his armies, and on September 5 took up his abode at the Stavka, where he lived a quiet, frugal life, much preoccupied with the health of his young son. General Alexeyev conducted the war. The Grand Duke Nicholas was relegated to the command against Turkey in the Caucasus. These tremendous events were watched by the Western Allies with sorrow that they had happened, and with relief that they were no worse. The hopes of the French command and the anxious attention of their British ally were centered upon the impending great offensive in Champagne and at Loos, due to be launched on September 25. Marshal Joffre's attack in Champagne, in which 50 divisions were to take part, was confidently expected by the French, to rupture strategically the entire German front in the west and to carry with it the consequences of Gorlice-Tano on 3 or 4 times its scale. These hopes were not to be attained. Italy also was at a standstill. On both the Isonzo and the Tyrol fronts, the Austrian defense was maintained. Terrible battles involving the supreme efforts of the best and largest armies were fought out bitterly in France, as they had been in Russia, but the crowning episode of the year lay in the Balkans, and it is thither we must now proceed.